All right, it looks like we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for a Caregiver's Guide to School Team Meetings. I am Jess Corinne, Head of Educational Services here at Learnfully. I started my career as a K-1 classroom teacher, super excited to dive into the classroom and apply everything that I had learned. I quickly realized that I didn't feel equipped to really serve the learners who needed a differentiated, individualized approach. And so I joined forces with Linda Mood-Bell Learning Processes and really refined the art of multisensory evidence-based implementation. I was a clinician, a consultant. I also served on the school services team where I went into districts and helped teach the teachers how to implement the programs on a global scale. And then I became an executive director and regional director for the West Coast. So I had quite a bit of experience in Linda Mood-Bell. Soon I realized I needed a little bit more of a reach. And so I went into private practice and got some more trainings under my belt, served my local community in a multiplicity of ways. And that's what brought me to Learnfully. I'm so excited to be here. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sheila Murphy-Brewer. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please dive in.
Hi, everyone. So I got into education a little differently. I was later in life, had 3 kids that were struggling in school, and really had to navigate the system by myself. Once I learned that in teacher education programs, they do very little to train teachers on how to support students with special needs. So it was really my focus area when I decided to go into education, to understand how to help students, and also how to help parents advocate for their own students, because I realized my own children were really blessed in that we could afford to have them get some extra support on outside of school. And as a native English speaker, I could support them also. So it was really important to me to help advocate with other families to ensure their students get the support they need. So I became an administrator with a strong focus in special ed. And as an educator, I was always constantly learning and bettering myself through different trainings and professional development to ensure I knew how best to support students with differentiated needs.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us. Also serving on our panel is Taya Slinglin, one of our educational specialists.
Hi. Okay, so I'm Taya Slinglin. I also started teaching in a K-1 classroom, which I always found amusing that we shared in that. I was the combo queen, taught for 6 years in combos, and I came across a little friend on the spectrum, and I just didn't feel I had everything she needed. I just loved this family, I loved this child, and I just wanted to do my very best. So I actually went back to school and re-credentialed and got my education specialist credentials so that I was prepared to work with children with disabilities, because the background's a little bit different from general ed. So I did that, and I've been serving as I did director of learning support for a large private school, and I have been a resource specialist for a lot of years. And I kind of went through one of my schools was actually very technology. We were paperless. So through that, I learned to embrace the technological chances, opportunities for us to really reach a broader breadth of students, especially kids that learn differently, and especially kids with anxiety. So that brought me this way. I met Jess and just reconnected with the same push forward thinking, and here I am at Learnfully, just looking for really reach out to more kids. That's my
love that. Well, we're happy to have you. Thanks for joining us. So today's agenda is as follows. I will give a brief overview into Learnfully's mission and offerings, and then we'll open up the floor for questions to our 2 panelists. We'll do a deep dive into school team meetings, SSTs, 504s, and IEPs in particular. And then we'll talk through some collaborative efforts that you can employ as caregivers. and then we'll have some discussion reflection. If anyone has questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat, and we will try our best to get to those at the end of the presentation or follow up if we're unable to answer them live. Learnfully is on a mission to empower neurodiversity by igniting learning and unlocking potential in all of our learners. We have a highly curated network of educational specialists who have certification, training, and personality to match in order to engage our learners online and sometimes in person. Our programs there's a wide range. We have a breadth of programs that we offer. We offer one-on-one group instruction, peer instruction, and a class format for learners of all needs and ages. And so a learner doesn't necessarily have to have a diagnosis for them to benefit from multisensory evidence-based instruction. They may or may not. We ensure that all of our implementation is differentiated and personalized. We start with the foundation first and then build upon that foundation so that a learner can lean in, feel successful and confident all along the way. We have an ever-growing platform of content in order to support our ecosystem around each and every one of our learners to ensure that the learner is continuing to progress in between sessions. And we make sure that the proactive communication channels are alive and well. So we are in constant contact with our learners' teams and caregivers to ensure that everyone sees progress firsthand and observes that growth, as well as feels equipped to support their learner when we are not with them during session. So we are so excited to be here and really want to serve as an educational resource for anyone involved in our learner's journey. Okay, so we broke down school meetings at a glance into 4 tiers, if you will. A lot of you have been through parent-teacher, caregiver-teacher conferences. Those are kind of a quick, expedited conversation around your learner's growth and potential challenges. Sometimes they feel extremely brief, and that for fair reason. Teachers have a lot going on. They're juggling quite a bit in the classroom, and to schedule those for their entire class is an obstacle that they are constantly overcoming. And so oftentimes if a learner is not, and we will go deeper into this, if they're not able to acclimate or able to respond to accommodations or modifications, then your educator will recommend one of 3 pathways. And that's what brings us here today. So we will dive into SSTs first and explain the ins and outs of what those entail. Then we'll give you more of a big picture overview into 504 plans and a little bit of a deeper dive into IEPs as well. All right.
Okay.
So let's get started. Let's do this. So for SSTs, I'd like to start with Taya. When you're thinking of an SST, what is an SST? How can a caregiver even know where to start with SSTs?
Okay, so an SST simply means student study team. It's just one of those acronyms we use. And I know sometimes those acronyms can sound overwhelming when you see them all together, SST, IEP. Basically, what it is our first more formal meeting that goes past the email exchange or those quick parent-teacher conferences when you know something isn't working. So typically what the educator is going to bring to the table is these are the concerns that I have as an educator. You're going to have an opportunity for you as a parent to share what your concerns are, because the parents is that continuity over years and really important. And after that, you're going to discuss what little interventions or what things you've tried. And that what you've tried is important and is the concern itself, because that really helps us understand, okay, you know what, we got to take this off the table and maybe we need to go deeper. Maybe we need to try reach in our bag of tricks and try something new. But truly the parent is a very integral part of this process. An SST typically lasts anywhere from 30, 45, that's really where it maxes out, because it is just a quick dive into it. Typically what you'll see is you're going to see the teacher you're going to see an education specialist or your RSP teacher, and you have a school representative that is there to kind of bring a broad breadth of knowledge to the table. So that way, if the teacher needs a little extra bags of tricks for the classroom, or you need a little extra bag of tricks at home, we're good to go. Now, sometimes the learner, if on the older end, if they're a little bit more independent, they'll be invited to the meeting to take ownership of their education. This won't typically happen for the younger kids, but when the older and more, depending on their level of independence, we will invite them in to take hold with that. Be prepared when you come. Bring everything. Don't feel like that binder isn't important. Your part, like I say, is really important as a parent. So bring back relevant background. Was there a problem at birth? When did they learn to talk? Any of that kind of stuff, developmental, can really play into some of the accommodations that we lead down. So bring it all. Notes will be taken, but this is not an IEP. So this is, as it says, not legally binding. So while they're taking notes, as a parent, I'd write them down too. Just, it's good to always compare. Everyone taking notes isn't going to get everything. So the more people taking them, I always thought was the better.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And it's true that SSTs exist over all academic environments, right? Private, independent, public.
The only thing different with private, sometimes we'll call them something different. We might not call it the same acronym, but the nuance is the same. And the teachers will go, if you went, hey, is this an SST? They're going to go, yes.
Yes.
So sometimes we call it an ILP or something like that, but into the IEP.
Great. Thank you for that. Appreciate it, Taya. What is a 504 plan meeting? I like to turn it to, sorry for the glitch, to Sheila. I'm curious how, of course, what it is, the broad stroke understanding, and how it differs from an SST.
Yeah, so a 504 plan's more formal, and it gives kids with disabilities supports that they might need. So it actually stemmed from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So there are laws, unlike an SST, there are laws around this one. So it's a little more formalized. And then each time that you do have a meeting, there is a committee that is very similar to your SST meeting. So you typically have all of the same players, a teacher, special ed, an administrator, parents. So it is definitely more formal. And then they want to cover, like, what are any of the conditions or limits that your student might have that affects their daily activity in a major way. And a daily activity could be academic, it could be also behavioral. So the schools look at information about a student from definitely different resources, maybe assessments that they've collected. A medical diagnosis is actually oftentimes included in a 504. The student grades, teacher recommendations, any maybe goal setting that has happened and measurable. So something around a SMART goal that was maybe measured, and then they can present the data that they've found. All of this is focused on ensuring ways to find success for students in their learning. So how does that happen? Or through accommodations and modifications. So sometimes the accommodations might include changes in their environment, like taking a test in a quiet space. Sometimes it's changes in their instruction, like checking in frequently for the teacher, just ensuring that they do check-ins, and if they're walking around, they're ensuring the notes are being taken, or if the student's starting to get off task or lost, there's little check-ins that might happen more often with a student with a 504. And then differences on how curriculum is presented. So for example, my own sons ended up with having printouts of presentations that were being shown on a large screen, they actually also had it in front of them so that they could take notes. So they weren't trying to look up, look down, look up, look down. So that's one example of, maybe how something is presented differently. So the difference, accommodations don't change what students learn. So they're learning the same exact curriculum as other students. It's just how they're learning it is being accommodated differently. So that because the goal is to remove the barriers and give the kiddos access to the learning. Not as common are modifications. So modifications change what the student is being taught and expected to learn. So maybe some students get fewer homework assignments. One of my sons did have that because it just became hours and hours impossible to complete. But if he understood a task or understood the assignment, he was able to do less. And it could be that they're just graded in a different way. So as long as this teacher can understand, the student understands the standards, maybe they are graded a little differently, as being assessed orally instead of written. Some of those kinds of things could potentially happen differently. So it's really important to know that a 504 is a legally binding document, and they are filed locally and federally. So those are exciting points of 504.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're going to get into this later, but in terms of for this in particular, for following up to a 504, how often does one typically meet for this meeting in particular to follow up on those accommodations and or modifications?
Historically in public schools, I've seen 504 meetings once to twice a year.
Okay.
It's really important though, as a parent, if you're not comfortable with that, to ensure that you do them once a semester. If you do have goals that you're setting with them, with the team, and you want to check in more frequently, you have the right to do that as well.
Great. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Okay, we're toggling. Now it's time for Taya. What is an IEP meeting? I feel like this is the end all be all of all meetings that caregivers have the most anxiety around, and rightfully so. So our intention is to ease that anxiety, but I'd love if you could just dive in briefly about what is an IEP and how can a caregiver go about being prepared and getting ready for it.
Okay, and that's my great takeaway as far as the IEP. I'm going to let Sheila start with the more formal technical side, and
Great.
then I'll jump in with the more parent side. But just broad breadth, IEP is an individual education plan, and it's kind of the higher level. If we were putting them on a hierarchy, we have the SST, the 504, and the IEP. So Sheila, do you want to go ahead and start with the technical side?
Yeah.
I'll sloop in with the parents.
Yeah, for sure. So as Taya said, IEP stands for Individual Education Plan or Program, some people say. And it is covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Act. So it is students are protected federally with this document. So that's why sometimes people do get a little more nervous about it, because it does seem really, really formal, and they are they can feel very intense. A student must have an IEP in order to receive special education services. So it's really important to know. Sometimes a student might have an IEP because they have speech services. So it's not necessarily a learning disability where they have goals within the learning in the classroom. It could be a speech therapy session. So they're really used for important things. You have to qualify under one of the 13 disabilities covered under the IDA. And so by law, the meeting must be scheduled when a parent or caregiver can attend. So that's really important, because there are dates, very strict dates around IEPs and them being done once a year. And if the school hasn't reached out, they could be out of compliance. So it's very important that they are trying to schedule with you in plenty of time to get you in there to have your annual or triannual meeting for an IEP. An annual is once a year. A triannual is that they have to be retested in all areas every 3 years. So should have put that up front. There are a lot of benefits to getting an IEP, and the process always begins with the evaluations. And there are many different tests depending on what the challenge area is that they will be given, and assessments by a school psychologist or the special education teacher. So these things do give your students, families, and school legal protections. So it's so important that you attend them and you do your homework ahead of time. And then you go to the meeting. And when you get to the meeting, it's always presented in a draft form. So it's really good to either see the IEP before you attend. I always requested mine ahead of time so I could really sit with it and develop the questions that I thought I might have, and get to know kind of their perspective, the perspective, because what you don't want to happen is to be blindsided or caught off guard when you get into the meeting. So it's really good to do your homework and figure out what parts of the IEP you might not even agree with. I think that's something to note also. I also would talk to my own sons. I only had sons, so your son or daughter, and I talked to them ahead of time, beforehand. And I would do this as young as first grade. Like, hey, what works really well? What do you love what the teacher does in this area? So they weren't necessarily attending the meeting, but I could go there and say, hey, my son said when you do this and this and this, it works really well. How can we incorporate this into the IEP? So really good to use your kiddo as your number one resource. And then knowing who's in the IEP. So the caregiver, you, general education teacher, one special ed teacher at least, a school or district representative. And I want to speak to this because oftentimes a school or district representative will either ask to be dismissed, which they can only be dismissed if you allow it and you sign off, or they won't show up, or they'll show up and they won't necessarily be engaged. And these are all things that I would not tolerate as a parent, and ensure that your district or administrator is present, and is engaged in your students' learning, because they are an important advocate for you, but they have to know what's going on. So it's also really good to know that you can bring a special education advocate to the IEP. I actually didn't bring an advocate with me, but what I would do is present my IEPs to one ahead of time. And I was always, asking them lots of questions so that when I would go into the meeting, I would have expertise from someone else besides me as a parent, and somebody else's eyes on it beforehand. And so I knew what questions to ask, or I knew what services to advocate for my own son. But your student can attend the IEP meetings, and that's really a call that a parent and student should make together.
That's brilliant.
Because on the flip side of it, my son, it's important to also give them the freedom to not attend, even if they're of age, because it can be uncomfortable. So.
I appreciate all that insight. And what stuck out to me was meeting with an advocate prior to, and doing kind of that dig into the IEP, so that you as a caregiver can enter the room feeling confident and equipped. So I appreciate that insight, Sheila, and I will turn the mic over to Taya as we talk about the caregiver's perspective.
So I'm going to piggyback on a few things Sheila said. She had some really great points. First of all, I'd like to start with the
Keeps happening.
An equal part of the team. It's really important to understand. I know as a parent, sometimes you go in a room and you're filled with a bunch of specialists, and that you're just a listening party, and that couldn't be further from the truth. You are very much a participatory party of this, And the information that you bring to that table, just like I mentioned earlier with the SST, provides that continuity over those years. So, be prepared with, IEP binder. There's a lot of resources online to find that, but kind of start filing everything because you are the child's true advocate. Not to mention that, or along that vein, is that their strengths and weaknesses. They know the strengths and weaknesses from this year, but knowing that historical is really important. Also, children will have this great capacity to do great all day and then melt down the second they get in the car. And I think sometimes parents are reticent to mention that, but truly, we as educators want to know that because we can ward off some of that steaming pot before we release them if we're aware it's occurring. So don't be afraid to mention it. Also, what Sheila had said with academic tasks, we have what's called an accommodation and we have what's called a modification. An accommodation can be lessening the amount of homework at home. We can say, as long as like she mentioned, as long as they can prove that they understand the concept, it doesn't need to be 30 math problems. It can be 3, as long as they're able to show that they understand it. So that accommodation is out there and acceptable. Another thing is with tests, how there's 4 answer choices. We can break it down to 3 answer choices, which lessens the cognitive load on the child and makes it easier for them, but doesn't take away from the efficacy of the test. So being aware of some of that versus the modification is when we actually go in and we change what the child is learning. And what the child is learning is those standards. And if we go too far, and I always want to make sure, because I don't know that every parent knows, that if you get too far in the modification versus the accommodation, it can change their ability to receive a diploma. So you want to make sure to ask that question, okay, if we're modifying this, is my child going to still receive a diploma? That's the one thing, that's the communication to be aware of as a parent. Then they're going to create goals. This is another part. You're giving them strengths and weaknesses and the meltdowns and those things. Those can be fed into the goals. So those goals need to be realistic for what the child can do, but also it's somewhat ambitious. You want to make sure that they're able to they're growing. Let's not just assume because they're here that in a year's time, they can't be much further along. So let's make sure we're balancing that. And your job is to monitor those services and supports. Like I said, you are the child's #1 advocate. Not to say that they won't, but you're kind of the gatekeeper. We have for a lot of things with their health and everything else. You don't be afraid to go and approach your team with that question. Is this designed for my child, or is this designed because this is, from a goal bank? Is this designed based on those those assessments that we created for this child? And the #1, are they being provided? Especially in these times, schools are just now getting back in session. Some are even going back to remote in some regards. Are the accommodations modified? Are these all being provided? Are the services being provided? And if they're not, make note of it, because what they owe you is what we call compensatory services. So if your child's missed those sessions, guess what? The school has to provide it later on at an agreeable time. So that's something, especially as we went through COVID, they didn't have a lot. They didn't get to take that year off. If they didn't get those sessions, it's within your right to get those. So another thing I didn't put on here is, like, to piggyback what Sheila said, if you have a tutor that's working with your child, don't be afraid to reach out and go, I'm going into IEP. Can you make some accommodations or recommendations for what I should be seeing? So you can go in with a list. I have an outside provider, Learnfully, hopefully. I have an outside provider that it suggested some of these things. Can we review this list as well and see if the team feels that these are amenable for my child? So that's some of that pre-work that you can do. If you have the draft, great. You can go through it with the coach. But
You can also, and correct me if things have changed, but you can also request that your educational specialist join all three of these meetings. So you can consult with them beforehand and debrief for after, but they can be an active participant in the conversation and speak to the progress they've observed and what they feel is realistic in terms of goals and baselines as well.
That is a perfect thing. I've done through Learnfully. We have done quite a few IEPs and jumping in, or even worked with the teacher leading up to the SST process. So it's, like I said, those accommodations that you're creating to see if we can ward it off any further thing, if we can do some interventions in the classroom. So getting that teacher in contact with those key stakeholders that are outside, don't be afraid to connect them via email. It's what we do.
Absolutely. I agree. Okay, let's move on. So, Sheila, I'd love if you could just break this down in a visual way for parents. I mean, I feel like we gave a very good overview and some key details about each meeting, but if you don't mind just giving us a breakdown, that would be helpful to sum it up.
Absolutely. So the beautiful diamond in the middle, we'll start there with what do they have in common? So neither of these are any cost to parents. So really important to know. And both of them are intended to meet the needs of the child. So determining the needs and then meeting their needs to ensure academic or social, emotional, behavioral success.
Great.
And they must have a request consent for the child to be evaluated. So they can't just kind of yank your kid out of the classroom and start testing them and then present you with like, here's what's wrong with your kiddo. It doesn't work like that. They do need to get consent from you. So hopefully it is a team decision based on the child's needs before any of these things happen. So it won't be a surprise that you would ever have any of these meetings. They would have been either come from you or the teacher, and you've worked along a path for this to occur. So they are covered differently and by different laws. So the 504 does have a little more loose laws around it than the IEP, which is mandated by the Disabilities Act and the education law there. So the 504 will establish needed accommodations, and we talked about, sometimes modifications, but very rarely in a 504 are modifications used, but they can sometimes appear in a 504. So it's not unheard of, but it really is about what accommodations will help your child to become successful. And it really is about focusing on how the student is learning. So maybe it's ADHD or a medical condition or behavior, and if they have these accommodations, they're able to learn. And so it really is about just setting the stage, setting the setting in the classroom to ensure success. Whereas an IEP sets really specific goals on the instruction, and then the pull out or push in services that your child gets from a special ed teacher focuses their instruction around these specific goals. So it really is about what students are learning that may or may not be at grade level. They might be reading a little below grade level, but they're building up those foundational skills to ultimately have them reading at grade level. So you're working on maybe small skill sets to achieve bigger goals later on, and that's where the SMART goals come in. And that's what you will find in an IEP are these learning goals that are very important that we probably didn't touch on quite. I think Taya did touch on them a little bit.
We can go much further in depth there, but wouldn't you say they also involve very distinguished deadlines and timelines, where the 504 is a little more broad in general. The IEP is very strict about when they're going to meet those SMART goals.
Absolutely. So yeah, your SMART goals are time bound. And so it's really important as a caregiver that you know when they're supposed to achieve the goal by, and you're getting updates on those. And I think we will be talking about that again a little bit later on.
We will, yes.
504 states don't receive additional funding for students, but IEPs, they do. And the 504 also, like I said, can be for any student with any disability, and it can also include medical conditions. An IEP has to be covered under the one of the 13 that they have defined as a disability.
And you can easily find those. Go ahead.
And it's not just the disability. They have to show that that disability is interfering with education. So, and that's a very stringent thing. So they can have, say they have dyslexia, they have to show that that dyslexia it has an impairment that's showing that deficit. So there's a 2-tier thing that occurs there.
Right. Yes. It can be challenging to qualify for an IEP for that reason, and many more, which we might need to do a second segment on this, right? to go even more into depth. Okay. So next, I'd like to just open it up for how can the parent best maximize these school team meetings? First step would be, of course, to collaborate. So either one of you wants to start with this. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So the first thing I is rapport. I mean, they're people.
Yeah.
So I had a parent, in fact, we're now dear friends because we became holding hands through the diagnosis and the whole process. But establishing that rapport early, especially if you, over the summer, you have that inclination, listen to it. Don't wait for them to come to you. Don't feel like you have to give them a break. Just listen to them and say, drop a note and say, hey, I've noticed this. It just kind of be that in, little voice in the background. Had a mother masterful at this. But another thing is that reading your audience. And Sheila, I'm going to have you speak to that a little bit because you're coming at it from a parent and you are, the way you describe it is masterful. So I'm going to have you go for that one.
Well, I think what's really important is that it's a very fine line. You're your child's advocate. And so the mama bear sometimes comes out and wants to pounce and get everything that you want for your kiddo. And I had many times where I think I went in there loaded for bear and just was really intent on getting what I felt like my son needed. But it's really important to sit back and be an advocate, but also look around and assume positive intent. Everybody is there for the betterment of what your child needs. And so I think this really can be done by doing your homework ahead of time, because you can sit back, you can listen, and you can kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, figure out where they're going, and then hopefully you can weave in your desires for your child into what they're saying. And so I think it's important to read the audience, because if you go in with this attitude of intense frustration, there's a good chance they're going to shut down and just label you as the problem, parent or caregiver. And then they're not going to be as open-minded because they're not feeling like you're being open-minded. So just kind of keeping the two-way conversation, which comes from, as Taya was saying, establishing a rapport. If you have a rapport, you'll be able to have that two-way dialogue and ensure that you're the advocate, but they are also the advocates, because you're reading the room, you're understanding where they're coming from also.
And that is, I knew you would say it well. The other thing, just to piggyback on what you said, is part of listening and having an open mind. Sometimes, and I knew this because I diagnose everything with my children online. So is someone's going to come up with, this really worked for my dyslexic child, or this really worked over here. And it's okay to bring it up, but listen to why if it doesn't work. Because your child, as with most diagnoses, there's a spectrum to them. There's a and just because it helped with that child doesn't mean it's going to help with this. Just like we don't all take the same heart medication, we don't take all the same diabetes medication. We have to maintain that prescriptive nature to make sure we get the best outcome. So it's okay to bring it up, but listen to their response. And if it's something they're like, yeah, we thought of that, but because of X, Y, and Z, we'd like to try this first.
Absolutely. And you've already nailed the last 2 points. So I'll just reiterate the importance of preparing, doing your homework, making sure that you bring work samples, feedback from specialists, as well as your learner, to ensure that you, again, feel equipped and can lean into the conversation. And then, as we all do, just keep your eyes on the prize. Your learner's confidence, success, and everything thereof is of the utmost importance. And I think sometimes these meetings can be a little intense, or it can be long, and sometimes you lose sight of that why, that main goal and the main purpose as to why you're there. And so I think that's something that I value in both of your advice. So okay, we wanted to close with just a couple different slides on following up. So I'll let Taya start with how to follow up right after the meeting, and then Sheila will go into how do you continue the follow-up process longer term.
Okay, so emailing, I like I said, everyone takes notes. And by emailing right after one, thanking them, thank you for coming to the team after school, thank you, because it really goes a long way. We're still people, teachers are still people, and we really we are doing this for it because we love it. And being recognized is kind of nice, especially in, with all that's going on right now. So, but also, it's a perfect opportunity for you to go, hey, I got away and I thought of these questions. Would you mind helping me with these? So list out your questions and review your notes and just have a couple, maybe 2-3 bullet points. Could you help me understand this? And the reason another thing is, I'm going to ask that you not sign that IEP. I know that they give it to you and you're sitting there and you're like, oh gosh, go home, think it through, read it. There's no immediacy. It's a nice to have, but it's not a have to have that you sign it right away. Go home and read it from stem to stern and come up with those 2 or 3 questions. And based on that response that you receive, then if the questions are answered, then go back and sign it. But why? I just want you to know that until you sign it, so don't wait too long. Your IEP is in a stay, which means that they're not going to change services. They're going to stay on the old IEP until the new one's signed, because they can't do anything without your consent. So, why I'm telling you to go home, I'm talking 2-3 days max. Don't wait 2-3 months and let it sit in the back burner, because your child services won't change.
That's great. And then if your questions aren't answered, you would request a follow-up meeting.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah. And also print and save all correspondence. Absolutely. Documentation. That's why I have it in email. I know it's not a pretty thing, but make sure you're documenting everything that's done. Email makes a natural documentation, and then put that in the binder. Great.
Thank you for that. So what do we do, on the longer term, not necessarily directly after the meeting, but, going forward, how do you make sure that you can maintain those follow-up efforts longer term?
Yeah. So one of, I think, the most important things, and as a parent, I don't even know that I fully understood the whole goal setting and the dates and the SMART goals until I went into education and then became an administrator. And I thought, wait a minute, that's what they were doing this whole time, is they were sending me updates on these goals. Which never really made sense to me to begin with. So it's really important to understand that when you're signing the IEP, you're agreeing that the special education teacher is going to have these particular goals for your student, and then they're going to have dates for the student to have met these goals. And they are need to report back to you after that date, because they've done a post assessment. So they have pre-data saying maybe your student knows 15 of the 26 letters of the alphabet, and by December they want them to know 22. So you should get a goal update in December saying, oh, they've either met the 22, or now they've they still need to work on it. So it's really important to know that you're going to be getting updates, and when to expect these updates, because that's the point of the IEP. You're setting goals for your student. And if you're not monitoring them, sometimes, unfortunately, the school, I've been in schools and I've been in districts where they're not really good at continuing the monitoring and the updating to parents, or they've reached the goal, and next thing you know, all the IEP goals have been met, and yet you have not set a new date for the IEP until the following year. So the question is, what are they working on in the meantime, right? So it's really important to understand what the goals are and to understand when they're going to be measured, so that you know how your kiddo is doing. And then if you have questions, be sure to follow up on a timely manner, that based on the goals. So ask. You have every right to ask, and you have every right to ask for an IEP meeting at any time during the year. Even though typically they're done annually, you can call an IEP meeting anytime you want. And it's really important to know that, because sometimes it is necessary.
And Sheila, go ahead. And Sheila, I'm going to jump in on that. Is you mentioned if those goals are met, they will continue to work on those goals. If say they're met in 6 months, they'll continue to work on those for the year. So if you got a report that says back that they've met all their goals, request that IEP. We need to come up with some new goals so that we can advance the child. So you're within your rights. Yeah.
And you
that's
did
a great problem.
Yeah, that's a great problem to have.
And it's happened.
If they're meeting their goals, let's move it along. But they will continue to work on the same one,
because they're beholden to those goals. So you want to make sure that you have.
Great. And it's just as important it's just as important to request the documentation to prove the mastery of the goals, as you know.
Very much so.
Absolutely.
Right. That's great. Well, geez, thank you, ladies, so much. One final question. I know we're running out of time, but I'd love to hear, just in brief, one thing that you want caregivers to keep in mind as they go through any of these 3 school team meeting experiences.
Shiv, you want to go first?
Sure. The one thing I would say to keep in mind is that you want to find your one person that your student trusts and knows, that you trust and know, to be your point person, to be your advocate, to be kind of your eyes and ears. And we were fortunate enough when my sons were in high school to have a teacher like this. And so when I didn't feel like things were going well, or one of my sons wasn't feeling comfortable in a situation with a teacher, especially when you start having 5 and 6 teachers throughout the day, that you have this one kind of point person at the school that they can go to and open up to, or that you can call and connect with. So it's really establishing the rapport that Taya was talking about, understanding that you want to establish a rapport with everyone, but if you can find that one person that cares about your son or daughter, or the child that you're caregiving for, they will work wonders to ensure your child has success.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Love that.
Okay, so mine is, I'm going to tell you what my professor told me, and it stuck with me. Document, document, document. Because that's what educators are told, to document everything. But I think it's more important for parents to document everything. Like I've mentioned a few times, have a binder so it's all together and you don't have to think about it. You can put it right in there. But especially during those transitional times, I've had more parents come to me and go, well, they promised this at this school, I'm going into high school, and none of it happened. Well, if you had a document and where you went, well, according to blah, 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 if you had all that down, then that serves as important part. So I just think that can't be said enough. The more you write down, you can't write down too much, and keep it all together.
Absolutely agree. Well, just since we're running low on time, I will briefly provide an overview on how Learnfully can help you through this process. Typically, we see learners, as I said, in an individualized, differentiated way, but we also serve as consultants for caregivers. And so if your learner were to go through our platform, we would, of course, start with a caregiver questionnaire. We would ensure that your learner has the opportunity to connect with our educational specialist and build rapport through a meet and greet. And then we would have a consultation to break down our short and long-term goals and recommendations. If you are a parent who is in need of coaching or consulting, we can absolutely help you in that effort. And so please don't let this be a deterrent. We do see learners directly, but we also support caregivers through each and every one of their processes. We offer remediation, enrichment, and executive functioning classes. And so if any of these are of interest to you and your learners, we are more than open to discussing options as well. Finally, we'd love to thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and welcome any and all questions that arise after the conclusion of this webinar. You feel free to go back and watch the recording, jot down those questions, email us at contact, call us, text us, or follow us on our social media channels, and we will be sure to reconnect with you at any given time. So thank you for joining us. We're so happy we can be here to support you.
Thank you.